Hey everybody, the results are in. This last summer, Mast Young Plants, just outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan, ran some special tests in their trial gardens, and they were addressing specifically questions that consumers would have. And the one that I really want to tell you about is their it's called plants per pot trial. And this is a question that comes in all spring long when we're planting up our annuals. People want to know, how many plants do I put per pot? Am I putting in too many? Am I not putting in enough? People are really curious about this. And this particular trial really does help answer some of those questions, but some of the results really shocked me. I was absolutely surprised by some of them. So let me start by telling you how they set up the trial. So for each variety of plant that they were testing, they had 3 identical 16-inch containers, and then they have 12 matching plants. And in one container, they plant 3 plants. In another container, they plant 4, and in the final container, they plant 5. Then they add drip irrigation, so these plants are getting consistent water and consistent fertilizer, and then they just measure the results. For some of the varieties, the results are what you might expect, where the one with 3 plants is a little smaller, meanwhile the one with 5 plants is bigger, maybe a little showier. And the example that they give us is the Adora Satin Rose Begonia. And they give us 2 photos, one from week 29 and one from week 32. Now, I want to emphasize that when they say week 29, it doesn't mean that it had been growing in that pot for 29 weeks. It just means that was taken on the 29th week of the year. So that's going to be middle of July, whereas week 32 is going to be the beginning of August. And that's just how the industry in our region kind of measures the year and when things are taken. So just want to make sure that you realize that. And if you look at these, you can definitely see the difference between the 3 plants per pot and the 5 plants per pot. I will say that the 4 plants per pot did really well though. So, I mean, if I was really looking to fill out a 16-inch container, I would immediately say, hey, 4 plants is perfect. You can see a little more branching, a little more fullness in some of that. And that's the case with a lot of the begonias that are out there, especially those tuberous begonias, as well as like the Riger, the Himalis. A lot of those varieties of begonias will look fuller if you add more plants. But there is an exception when we're talking about begonias in particular, like the wax begonias. So those are the varieties that have those thick, waxy, round tip leaves. They didn't include any wax begonias in their report, but I happened to be there right around week 30 or 31, and I did get to see the Viking Explorer Rose on Green begonia that they had. So this is a wax begonia that's quite vigorous. It's going to be in the same kind of category as, say, the Whopper, the Dragon Wing, the Surefire, big begonias, Megawatt. Those would be all different varieties that are known for getting very large. And when you have a vigorous begonia like that, when I look at the photos of how they grew, there actually is very little difference between the 3, 4, and 5 plants per pot. When I look at this photo in particular, the one with 4 actually looked probably the best, but you can see in this kind of situation, putting more does not actually get you more. So I would say stick to 3 or 4 and you're going to be in really good shape. But that's specifically with those vigorous varieties. If you have like the little begonias that come in the little 4-packs or 6-packs or that type of thing, those tend to stay a little bit smaller. So they tend to be more like 8 inches or 10 inches in size. Those are never going to get super large. So you're going to need more of those in a container. But when you have those really vigorous varieties, definitely you're going to be able to use a lot fewer and have really good results. Another one they include in the report is the Marguerite Ipomea, or Ipomea, and that is sweet potato vine. And I was a little surprised by this one because usually when I think of sweet potato vine, I think of it being vigorous. It's kind of a Boolean container sometimes, kind of pushes out other plants, especially the big vining varieties. There are some other more compact varieties, but usually when we think of sweet potato vine, especially the lime ones, they can be really vigorous. But when we look at the samples here in week 29 and in week 32, there's definitely more growth in that one with 5, the one with 3, a little smaller, a little more tame. I would be very curious though to see what this looked like through August and September, because that's usually when the heat comes on. We see that sweet potato vine really take off. So I'm curious how they were performing later on in the season, because sweet potato vine is one of those plants that here in our area usually takes a little while to kind of pick up its momentum and really start growing. So it'd be interesting to see more on this one, but it is interesting to see how much of a difference putting 3 plants versus 5 plants can be. Now, there were a lot of varieties where you didn't really notice much of a difference in them. And so some of those examples that they give are going to be like with the Coleus, and they use the Talverna Moondust Coleus, beautiful Coleus, by the way. And you can see Week 29, pretty much the one with 3 had caught up with the one with 5, and then in week 32 you really couldn't see a difference. And I saw that with all the Coleus that they had on display in there. The Coleus, especially these bigger varieties, and that's the other thing to note, that these are varieties that get at least 24 inches tall. I think some of them they get even bigger than that. So with those, you don't have to worry too much about how many you put in. You could put 1 in there, and a lot of times they get enormous as well. So 1, 2, or 3 is going to give you sometimes the same results as just putting 5 in there. Another plant where less plants often means less of a show are with impatiens. And I'm speaking specifically about your regular impatiens. So like your beacon impatiens or some of the other ones that you grow. A lot of times they are in those small packs as well. Those, the more you put in, the better they're going to do. Now, when it comes to the New Guinea impatiens, they can get pretty large, and they have some pretty good examples that they had included in here. So when you look at the SunPatiens, both the compact lavender and the vigorous peach candy, there's very little difference between the varieties, whether there were 3, 4, or 5 plants in there. But in this photo, I think it's nice because you're also able to see the difference in the size between the vigorous SunPatiens and the compact SunPatiens. Compact SunPatiens do still get really large, so those I think are a good all-purpose one. If you're really looking to fill things out though, then you can look at that Vigorous variety. Now I did look at the Spectra series, and in their particular example, it ended up that the one with 3 actually looked better than the one with 1, and this is not the only time that this happens, which surprises a lot of people, I think, because how is it possible that a container with 3 of the same plants can look bigger than one with 5 of the same plants? And what they talk about in here is the fact that those 5 plants are all competing for the same resources, so the same soil and the same nutrients and the same water. And so by having fewer plants in that container means that those fewer plants can really thrive, whereas they're not fighting as much with each other as they are with the ones with more. So less plants in many cases can be a little better, and I've been talking about this quite a bit, and I think a lot of you are starting to tune into that. But it's interesting to see it in action, especially like in a trial garden, and it becomes really obvious with a couple other plants. So one in particular was the Sanvitalia. They have the Thalia Great Yellow Sanvitalia, and the surprising thing about this one is look at the one on the left. That one only has 3 plants. Meanwhile, when we move along, get to the one on the right, that one has 5 plants, and there is such a dramatic difference in the growth and the size of those plants. It's surprising to think that the one with 5 turned out to be one of the smallest ones in the bunch, and that probably is due to the fact that the Sanvitalia, which is also called a creeping zinnia, I think, that one does tend to get a pretty good root system, and so those roots are probably competing for that extra space. But that was one that really surprised me because I wasn't expecting that to be the plant that really showed off that way. There were several other plants where it became clear that putting more plants in didn't always yield better results. A prime example of that was with the scaevola. So they had the Bombay Compact Dark Blue and the Surdiva Fashion Pink scaevolas planted in there. And when you look at those, it really is the one with 4 that tended to look the best, have the fullest, kind of nicest look to it. The one with 3 did keep up pretty well, looked pretty good. The one with 5 was actually sometimes a little bit smaller. Now it's going to vary a lot depending on what variety you're having and what other conditions are out there, but it does tell us, like with scaevola, a little bit can go a long way. You just have to remember that with scaevola, it is a slower starter, so we don't usually start seeing a lot of growth on that until July. In our area, that means it has a little bit shorter season, but once it gets going, it's unbelievable. Another one that I was surprised at was the Lobelia, because in general, the Lobelia did just fine with 3 versus 5. We might notice a little bit more fullness in the one with 5, but I don't know, I was pretty happy with how it looked with the 3. And remember, these are also quite vigorous varieties, so there's the Techno Electric Blue and the Magadi Dark Blue, and both of these are varieties that can take quite a bit of sun. Now, if you're in the south or in a really hot area, Lobelia probably isn't going to do so well for you, but in Michigan, we're able to put these types of varieties out in the sun. They do fine. There are some other varieties that maybe won't do quite as well, but take a look. I mean, those are some really nice examples right there. Now, petunias can make things a little bit interesting. So they had varieties that would be on par with like super petunias. And I should note that Mast Young doesn't grow proven winter plants. So they're not going to have the Supertunias or the Superbenas or anything like that. So they're going to have ones that I would say would be in the same kind of category as a Supertunia. So the petunias I'm talking about are very, very similar to a Supertunia. So they had the headliner lavender picotee, and you can see there's not a big difference between the three different containers. If anything, it's the one with 4 that's really holding its own. It's a beautiful ball of color, and the one with 5 is actually a little bit more compact than some of the other ones. So when you get these vigorous varieties petunias, you don't have to worry as much, and we see that also with the tea magenta vein, same type of thing. Now I do notice that the one with 5 does look like it's spreading a little bit more, so we are seeing a little bit more growth with that one, but that one with 4 looks fantastic. Another one they had was the Capella Fuchsia Lace, and there's only 2 samples here. I think the third one was behind me, but the interesting thing is the one on the left only had 3 plants, the one on the right had 4, and you can see the one on the left with the only 3 plants is doing absolutely fantastic. The one on the right looks great, but tells us that we don't necessarily need to put 4 or 5 plants in a 16-inch when we can get away with 3. And Capella is a more compact variety, but the interesting thing about it is that it does continue growing, so it just tends to be a slower growing one, so it doesn't fill out pots as fast as, say, a Supertunia or a Headliner or Sanguna or all these other varieties that are out there, but it does get nice and full, gets a really good size, and it just kind of takes its time getting to that full size. But look at what it does with 3 plants. Absolutely fantastic. Now, I didn't notice a big difference with the Dahlias that they had in there. By the time I got there, they were all the same size, whether they had 3 plants or 5 plants. So that tells us with Dahlias, better to spread those out a little bit because they do get quite large, especially the varieties that they had on sample. So you don't necessarily need to have so many in there. Similarly, the verbena was kind of the same story where it really didn't matter how many were in there. The results were very, very similar. And we're seeing that also with geraniums. So they had the Calliope Dark Red, the Moxie Dark Red, and the Patriot Bright Red. And all 3 of them really were holding their own by week, like I said, 30 or 31 when I was there. So when you get these more vigorous varieties of geraniums, it's another case. And I think that's kind of the theme here. When you have vigorous plants, you don't need as many in a pot. Now, if you have compact varieties, then you do need to add more of those plants if you want to have that impact. So it makes sense if you're trying to save money to buy those vigorous varieties. They might cost you a little bit more, but they are going to go a little farther. Now, Angelonia, kind of in the end, the same thing. They didn't use any examples to show us where they were at, but I do see that there is more branching in the one with 5 plants. But the result with this Alonia Big Bicolor Pink and the Carita Raspberry Angelonia, not real noticeable. I think it's another plant where you can get away with the 3 and it's going to look fantastic. I have to confess, with Calibrachoa, I was expecting to see the one with only 3 plants to be smaller than the one with 5 plants, but with the examples that they had used, not a big difference. So they had the Cali Mango, and when we look at that one, I will say the one with 5 does look a little wider, a little fuller, but ultimately the one with 4 looks really strong, and that one with 3 actually is holding up really, really well. They also use the Aloha Kona Pineapple Calibrachoa, and looking at that one, it's the one with 4 that really stands out. Beautiful, perfect mounded habit. And I think these are actually even a little smaller than what we'd see with like the Super Bell series and the Cha-Cha series that are out there. So although the Cali I think is pretty normal size one. I can't remember the exact sizes of all of them, but just nice to see that Calibrachoa can hold their own and that we can hold back a little bit on Calibrachoa and not feel like we have to pack those containers quite as full. And I think that's kind of the end result is like, hey, we might not have to be putting in so many, especially I've talked about this before, like the Proven Winners recipes tend to have, 5 to 7 to 9 plants per container. And I think in the end, you can really pull back on those. You just have to arrange them in the pot so they're going to intertwine a little bit better, or you have to accept the fact that maybe it's going to be doing halvesies where one side's going to have one plant, one side's going to have the other. But it really does tell us this. And that supports one of the observations that they published in this report was that those containers with 5 plants, those 5 plants were competing for resources, whether it be soil, water, fertilizer, and as a result, they weren't going to get quite as big as the ones that had a little more room to grow, a little bit more root space, a little bit more airflow sometimes can help that as well. So they're basically saying like, hey, sometimes we can pull back. Their end decision was, hey, in a 16-inch container, those 4 plants in there were consistently the best looking, which is interesting because we would expect that, oh, maybe, putting more is going to make them look better. But their final report said, hey, you know, 4 is a really good number, but they also emphasized that it really depends on when you want them to be kind of at their prime, or when you want them to be what we call finished. And so if you put more plants in, they're going to reach that finished point much earlier than if you put fewer in. So they didn't necessarily say at what week or how many weeks those need to be able to reach that point, but you really saw it like with the Coleus, where even by, you know, when they're measuring it middle of July, they were already pretty much equal. But if we were, say, 3 weeks or 4 weeks earlier, we would have seen probably a much more notable difference in the size. So if you have something going on in June and you're in Michigan, you're going to need to really pack those plants really full if you want it to look really nice and full. But as we get farther in season, this is evidence that you just have to be a little more patient, but the result is going to be the same, if not better, in many of these cases. They also had some amazing celosia. These are some more vigorous varieties. They had the Coleus Fire Red and the Intense Dark Purple. Holy smokes, these plants got huge, and you can see you could not tell the difference between the ones with 3 plants and the ones with 5 plants. Didn't really make a difference at all. As you guys know, I absolutely love these kind of experiments. In fact, I would have loved if they had gone even more in depth, like we could see photos like every 2 weeks for the entire season and be able to do that comparison, because I really want to know, like, when was it that you know, one with 3 plants really caught up with the one with 5, and you know, when did things start going sideways for some of these? Like, you know, will they hold up all the way till September, or will we start seeing those ones with 5 starting to struggle? I'm not real sure about all that, but hey, I'm really grateful that they put this together. I mean, my conclusion really is, like, we don't have to put so many of these vigorous varieties of plants into our containers. Again, I'm saying vigorous varieties. Look at your tags and see what size they get to, because if you're buying compact varieties or smaller varieties, you're not going to see these same results. And also remember that all of these containers were consistently watered and consistently fertilized. So if you're putting your plants under water stress, whether you're putting too much water or not enough, or you're not fertilizing, you will not see these results at all. In fact, that changes everything. So if you're not fertilizing, I'm going to say every single week with a water-soluble fertilizer. However, you could, you know, go every other week. Some people go, you know, they take 2 weeks off in between, but just make sure that you're giving them that fertilizer if you want to have results like this. It's just fantastic. And I just love the fact that we can stretch our plants out more. So we can keep our budget the same, but we'll get more if we spread those vigorous varieties out among more containers. And that way we have even a bigger show without having to spend really more money. I don't know. I like that idea. I think you guys might too. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you guys have been kind of pulling back on the number of plants that you've been putting in, because let's face it, with the new breeding that's out there, we're seeing more and more vigorous varieties come on the market, and it can be pretty incredible to see what they do. So I'd love to hear your comments down below, and I'll see you guys next time. They have another experiment in there that's a fertilizer trial, and I think you guys are going to really like that one as well. So I'll get to that one a little bit later, but it's all pretty interesting.